Seattle, 2000. The city that gave the world grunge, Microsoft and the Green River Killer, a serial murderer who dumped 49 bodies in the forests and rivers surrounding the tech capital before his 2001 arrest. When 29-year-old web developer Marcus Thompson disappeared after leaving his Amazon office in March 2000, detectives initially feared they had another Ridgeway victim. But Marcus wasn't a sex worker picked up on Pacific Highway South. He was a Stanford graduate making $120,000 a year, living in a South Lake Union apartment that cost more per month than most Seattle families made in 6. His Jeep Cherokee was found abandoned on a logging road off I-90, deep in the Cascade foothills where hikers disappeared for weeks and bodies decomposed before anyone found them. Inside the vehicle, his North Face jacket, his Nokia cell phone displaying 47 missed calls from his worried girlfriend, and a single beer bottle that didn't belong to him. For 20 years, that beer bottle sat in a Washington State Patrol evidence locker while the case went cold and Seattle transformed from grunge capital to tech utopia. The killer had been meticulous, no fingerprints, no witnesses, no motive anyone could find. But he'd made one mistake: he'd taken a drink. In 2020, forensic genealogists uploaded the DNA from that bottle to GEDmatch and traced it through 4 generations of Pacific Northwest families to a man nobody had suspected. A man whose connection to Marcus was so random that traditional investigation would never have found it. The arrest didn't just solve a murder, it exposed how easy it was to vanish in a city obsessed with the future, and how the mountains that made Seattle beautiful also made it the perfect place to hide a body for 2 decades. The last confirmed sighting of Marcus Thompson alive occurred at 6:47 p.m. on March 18, 2000, captured by a security camera in the lobby of Amazon's headquarters on Beacon Avenue South. He was wearing what his colleagues called his uniform khaki pants, a navy blue fleece vest over a button-down shirt, and the wire-rimmed glasses he'd worn since college. He carried a black messenger bag stuffed with printouts of code and a dog-eared copy of a programming manual he'd been studying during his commute. In the grainy footage, he waved to the security guard, a man named Dennis Park, who'd later tell investigators that Marcus seemed normal that evening. Maybe a little tired, but nothing unusual for someone working 70-hour weeks at a company that was reinventing retail. Marcus had moved to Seattle 18 months earlier, in October 1998, when Amazon was still primarily a bookseller, and the company's stock was climbing so fast that employees refreshed their portfolios multiple times a day. He'd graduated from Stanford with a degree in computer science, turned down offers from Oracle and Sun Microsystems, and chosen Amazon because he believed in what Jeff Bezos was building, or at least that's what he told his parents when they questioned why he was moving to a rainy city on the opposite coast. The truth, which he admitted to friends over beers at the Virginia Inn, was more complicated. He wanted to be part of something from the beginning, to write code that millions of people would use, to prove he could make it in the epicenter of the tech revolution. Seattle in 2000 was a city transformed and transforming. The dot-com boom had turned the Pacific Northwest's largest city into a magnet for ambitious young people from across the country, all chasing the same dream of stock options and IPOs. South Lake Union, where Marcus lived, was in the early stages of what would become a massive redevelopment, with old warehouses being converted into loft apartments and new construction cranes dotting the skyline. His apartment on Westlake Avenue cost $1,800 a month for a 1-bedroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Union, a price that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier, but seemed reasonable in an economy where 25-year-olds were becoming millionaires overnight. But beneath this gleaming surface of innovation and wealth, Seattle carried darker legacies. The Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, had terrorized the area throughout the 1980s and 1990s, murdering at least 49 women, most of them sex workers picked up along the Pacific Highway South corridor. By March 2000, Ridgway hadn't yet been caught, though advances in DNA technology would lead to his arrest just 14 months after Marcus disappeared. The knowledge that a serial killer had operated undetected for nearly 2 decades cast a shadow over every missing person case in King County, creating a baseline anxiety that maybe, just maybe, the killer was still out there. Marcus's girlfriend Rachel Steinberg reported him missing at 11:37 p.m. on March 19, roughly 29 hours after he'd left work. She'd grown increasingly frantic as the evening of the 18th had stretched into night without any contact from him. They'd made plans to meet for dinner at a Thai restaurant in the University District at 8 p.m., a standing Saturday night tradition during the 3 months they'd been dating. Rachel was a graduate student in biology at the University of Washington, and she'd met Marcus at a house party in Fremont, where they'd bonded over their shared love of hiking and their mutual bewilderment at Seattle's obsession with coffee. When Marcus didn't show up for dinner and didn't answer his phone, Rachel had initially assumed he'd gotten caught up at work, a frustratingly common occurrence in their relationship. But as the hours passed and her calls went straight to voicemail, the assumption curdled into worry. She drove to his apartment building around 10 p.m., buzzed his unit repeatedly, and when there was no answer, convinced the building manager to let her inside. The apartment was empty, neat, with no signs of disturbance. Marcus's desktop computer was in sleep mode, his bed was made, his toothbrush sat in its holder in the bathroom. Everything suggested he'd left that morning, intending to return that night. Rachel sat in his living room for 2 hours, calling his cell phone over and over, leaving increasingly desperate messages, before finally driving to the Seattle Police Department's East Precinct to file a missing person report. The officer who took her statement, a patrol cop named Jennifer Oakes, listened with the practiced patience of someone who'd handled dozens of similar reports, most of which resolved within 24 hours when the missing person turned up hungover at a friend's house, or embarrassed after a spontaneous trip they'd forgotten to mention. But Oakes noted details that elevated her concern. Marcus was described as responsible and punctual. He'd never missed work without calling, he had no history of mental health issues or substance abuse, and perhaps most significantly, he worked for Amazon, which meant he was exactly the kind of person who didn't just disappear without someone noticing quickly. Oakes escalated the report to the missing persons unit, and by morning of March 20th, Detective Thomas Brandt had been assigned the case. Brandt was 48 years old, a 22-year veteran of the Seattle Police Department, who'd worked his share of missing person investigations that turned into homicides. He'd been peripherally involved in the Green River Task Force during the late 1980s, and that experience had taught him that in the Pacific Northwest, with its dense forests and deep waters and miles of coastline, bodies could stay hidden indefinitely if the killer knew where to look. Brandt's first step was to trace Marcus's movements on March 18th. He interviewed colleagues at Amazon, who'd worked with Marcus that Saturday, a common occurrence at a company where weekend coding sessions were not just accepted but expected. They all told similar stories. Marcus had been focused on a particularly challenging piece of back-end infrastructure, something involving database optimization that most of them didn't fully understand because that wasn't their specialty. He'd seemed frustrated but not despondent, determined to solve the problem before the weekend ended. Around 4 p.m., he'd told his cube mate, a programmer named David Chen, that he was going to head home soon, grab dinner, and work on the problem from his apartment where he could think more clearly. Security logs showed Marcus had badge swiped out of the building at 6:44 p.m., consistent with the lobby camera footage. The parking garage cameras captured him walking to his Jeep Cherokee, a green 1997 model he'd bought used when he'd first moved to Seattle, and driving out onto Beacon Avenue at 6:52 p.m. From there the trail went cold. Traffic cameras in 2000 were far less ubiquitous than they would become in later years, and there were significant gaps in coverage, particularly in residential neighborhoods. Brandt obtained footage from major intersections between Amazon's headquarters and Marcus's apartment, but the Jeep didn't appear on any of them, which suggested Marcus had either taken a different route or had gone somewhere else entirely. Rachel provided access to Marcus's apartment, and Brandt conducted a thorough search with a forensic team. They found his desktop computer and imaged the hard drive, discovering nothing suspicious in his emails or browser history beyond the usual mix of work correspondence, online shopping, and visits to early internet forums about programming and hiking. His bank records showed no unusual activity. His credit cards hadn't been used since Friday afternoon when he'd bought lunch at a deli near his office. His phone records indicated the last call he'd made was to Rachel at 5:23 p.m. on Saturday, a brief conversation where he'd confirmed their dinner plans and said he'd be leaving work soon. The break in the case came on March 23, 5 days after Marcus disappeared, when a couple hiking near Snoqualmie Pass called 911 to report finding an abandoned vehicle on a Forest Service logging road. The location was approximately 40 miles east of Seattle, deep in the Cascade foothills accessed via Interstate 90. The road itself was unpaved, winding through dense Douglas fir forest and used primarily by hunters and occasional hikers who knew the area well. It wasn't the kind of place you ended up by accident. The Jeep Cherokee matched the description of Marcus Thompson's vehicle, and when Brandt arrived at the scene 3 hours later, his stomach was already tight with the certainty that this case had crossed from missing person to something darker. The Jeep was parked roughly 2 miles from where the logging road intersected with a paved Forest Service route, positioned at a slight angle, as if it had been pulled over quickly, rather than carefully parked. The driver's door was closed but unlocked. Marcus's North Face jacket lay across the passenger seat, and his Nokia cell phone was in the center console, its battery long dead. The most significant item was a single beer bottle, a Heineken, sitting in the cup holder on the passenger side. It was approximately 1/3 full, and condensation rings on the console suggested it had been cold when placed there, though by the time investigators found it, the contents had reached ambient temperature. Brandt immediately recognized the significance of the beer bottle. Marcus's friends and colleagues all described him as a light drinker, who preferred wine to beer, and when he did drink beer, he favored local microbrews, never imports like Heineken. More importantly, the bottle's position in the passenger cup holder suggested someone other than the driver had been drinking it. The forensic team photographed everything extensively before carefully bagging the bottle as evidence, using sterile gloves and containers to preserve any DNA or fingerprints it might contain. A grid search of the surrounding forest was initiated immediately, with search and rescue teams from King County and volunteers from the local community spreading out in careful lines through the woods. They were looking for Marcus's body, though no one wanted to say it aloud in front of Rachel and Marcus's parents, who'd flown in from California the moment they'd heard their son was missing. The terrain was challenging, thick with underbrush and fallen logs, the ground still partially frozen from winter, and covered in a dense mat of pine needles and moss that could conceal almost anything. The search continued for 8 days, covering a radius of approximately 3 miles from where the Jeep was found. They used cadaver dogs, thermal imaging equipment, and dozens of trained volunteers who understood that time was critical, that if Marcus was out there injured, every hour decreased his chances of survival, and if he was dead, the longer they waited, the more difficult recovery would become. But despite all these efforts, they found nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no trace of Marcus Thompson beyond his abandoned vehicle and the mysterious beer bottle. The beer bottle was sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory in Seattle for analysis. In 2000, DNA testing was well established but still relatively time-consuming and expensive compared to later years. The lab technicians swabbed the bottle's mouth, where they found epithelial cells from someone who'd drunk from it, and ran a full DNA profile. The profile was clean and complete, belonging to a male donor who was not Marcus Thompson. They ran the profile through CODIS, the national DNA database that contains samples from convicted offenders and arrestees in participating states. The search came back negative, no matches. Whoever had drunk from that beer bottle had either never been arrested or had been arrested before DNA collection became standard procedure. The investigation expanded to examine Marcus's personal life in greater detail. Brandt interviewed Rachel extensively, asking uncomfortable questions about their relationship, whether Marcus had mentioned being followed or threatened, whether he'd had conflicts with anyone, whether there were parts of his life she wasn't aware of. Rachel, exhausted and grieving, answered everything honestly. Their relationship had been good, normal, marked by the typical challenges of two busy people trying to make time for each other. Marcus had never mentioned feeling threatened. He was well liked at work, didn't gamble, didn't owe money, had no ex-girlfriends or ex-boyfriends harboring resentment. He was by all accounts exactly what he appeared to be, a hard-working, somewhat introverted software engineer, who loved hiking, read science fiction novels, and had moved to Seattle to be part of something he believed was changing the world. Brandt also investigated the possibility that Marcus's disappearance was connected to the Green River Killer, though this seemed unlikely given the victim profile. Gary Ridgway had targeted vulnerable women, most of them involved in sex work, picking them up in his truck along Pacific Highway South before strangling them and dumping their bodies in or near the Green River. Marcus was a well-paid professional man who lived in a secure apartment building and worked at one of the city's most prominent companies. There was no obvious connection to Ridgway's pattern. Still, Brandt contacted the Green River Task Force and shared the details of Marcus's case, just in case there were angles he wasn't seeing. The forensic analysis of Marcus's Jeep revealed additional details that deepened the mystery without solving it. The vehicle's interior was relatively clean, with no signs of struggle or violence. Fingerprints were found on various surfaces, most of them belonging to Marcus, with a few partial prints that couldn't be matched to anyone in the system. There was no blood, no defensive wounds, no torn fabric or broken items that would indicate a fight had occurred. The only anomaly was the beer bottle, and even that wasn't necessarily sinister on its surface. Marcus could have given someone a ride, and that someone could have been drinking a beer with Marcus's permission. The significance of the bottle only became clear when combined with everything else: the remote location, Marcus's disappearance, the lack of any logical explanation for why he'd be on that logging road in the first place. Brandt developed several theories, though none felt entirely satisfying. Theory 1: Marcus had met someone, possibly through an online connection, and had driven with this person to a remote location for reasons unclear. Perhaps a drug deal, though Marcus had no history of drug use. Perhaps a romantic encounter, though he was in a relationship with Rachel and all evidence suggested he was faithful. Theory 2: Marcus had been carjacked or abducted, possibly from a gas station or rest stop along I-90, and forced to drive to the logging road where something terrible had happened. Theory 3: Marcus had witnessed something he shouldn't have, something involving someone dangerous, and had been killed to ensure his silence. This last theory seemed the most far-fetched, but Brandt had been a detective long enough to know that the most implausible explanations sometimes turned out to be correct. As weeks turned into months, the investigation stalled. The media covered the case extensively at first, with local news stations running segments about the missing Amazon employee, newspapers publishing photos of Marcus and maps of the area where his Jeep was found. "Who killed Marcus Thompson?" read one headline, though at that point, there was no confirmation he'd been killed, only the increasingly likely assumption based on the circumstances. The coverage attracted tips, some credible, most not. People reported seeing someone who looked like Marcus at rest stops, in small towns along the Canadian border, hitchhiking on remote highways. Every lead was followed up, and every lead went nowhere. Marcus's parents, David and Laura Thompson, established a reward fund of $50,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of whoever was responsible for their son's disappearance. They hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent named Robert Caldwell, who'd worked high-profile cases and came highly recommended. Caldwell spent 6 months re-interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, and developing his own theories, but ultimately, he arrived at the same dead end the police had reached. Without Marcus's body, without witnesses, without any clear motive or suspect, the case was unsolvable using traditional investigative methods. By the end of 2000, the Marcus Thompson case had been unofficially designated as cold, though it remained technically open. Brandt moved on to other cases, though he kept the file in his desk drawer and thought about it more often than he would have liked. The beer bottle sat in an evidence locker at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, carefully stored and catalogued, its DNA profile preserved in the lab's database and in CODIS, waiting for a match that might never come. Seattle, meanwhile, continued its transformation. The dot-com bubble burst in late 2000, wiping out many of the startups that had driven the city's rapid growth, but Amazon survived and thrived, growing into one of the world's most valuable companies. South Lake Union, where Marcus had lived, became one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city, dominated by Amazon offices and high-rise apartments that cost exponentially more than the $1,800 Marcus had paid for his one-bedroom. Rachel Steinberg finished her PhD and moved to San Diego for a postdoctoral position, unable to stay in a city where every street corner reminded her of someone who'd simply vanished. She never fully moved on, telling friends years later that losing Marcus the way she had without answers or closure was harder than if she'd known for certain he was dead. The not knowing became its own kind of torture, the perpetual question of whether he was still alive somewhere, suffering amnesia, or held captive, or living a new life under a different name. Rationally, she knew none of these scenarios were likely, but the human mind clings to hope even when hope becomes cruelty. The years passed. 2001 brought the 9/11 attacks, which dominated national attention and made a single missing person case in Seattle seem small by comparison. 2001 also brought the arrest of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, whose capture through DNA evidence vindicated the belief that forensic science could solve even the coldest cases. Ridgway confessed to 49 murders and was sentenced to life in prison without parole, closing one of the Pacific Northwest's darkest chapters. For families like the Thompsons, who'd lost someone to violence, Ridgway's arrest offered proof that killers could be caught decades after their crimes, but it didn't bring back Marcus or provide any new leads in his case. Detective Brandt retired from the Seattle Police Department in 2008, still carrying the burden of unsolved cases, with Marcus Thompson's among the heaviest. At his retirement party, colleagues presented him with a shadow box containing his badge, his nameplate, and photographs from significant cases he'd closed. Conspicuously absent were photos from cases like Marcus's, the ones that got away, the ones that reminded every detective that not all stories have satisfying endings. In his brief speech, Brandt mentioned that the hardest part of the job wasn't dealing with the horror of what people did to each other, but rather living with the knowledge that sometimes, despite your best efforts, justice remained out of reach. Seattle in 2010 was nearly unrecognizable compared to the city Marcus had known. Amazon had transformed South Lake Union into a sprawling urban campus, with glass towers bearing the company's Smile logo visible from almost every vantage point. Housing prices had skyrocketed, pushing out many longtime residents and creating a city increasingly divided between tech workers and everyone else. The cultural identity that had defined Seattle in the 1990s, grunge music, independent coffee shops, a certain Northwest authenticity, had been largely supplanted by a tech monoculture that prioritized efficiency and innovation over character and history. Whether this was progress or loss depended on who you asked and how long they'd lived there. The Marcus Thompson case file gathered dust in the Seattle Police Department's cold case archives, periodically reviewed by new detectives who'd heard about it during training, but who ultimately had no new avenues to pursue. The beer bottle remained in the Washington State Patrol evidence locker, its DNA profile still in CODIS, still checking automatically against new entries, still returning no matches year after year. Technology had advanced significantly since 2000. DNA testing had become faster and more sensitive. Forensic genealogy, the technique that would eventually solve the case, was beginning to be used experimentally, though it wouldn't gain widespread attention until the Golden State Killer's arrest in 2018. David Thompson died in 2015, his heart giving out at age 73, worn down by grief, and 15 years of searching for a son he'd never found. At the funeral, Laura told friends that David had never accepted Marcus's death, had continued to believe until his final days that somehow, someday they'd get answers. She confessed that she'd given up that hope years ago, that she'd come to terms with never knowing, and that this acceptance, painful as it was, had allowed her to keep living while David had remained frozen in 2000, unable to move forward. Then in 2018, the world changed for cold case investigations. A genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter and a team of investigators used public genealogy databases to identify the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who terrorized California in the 1970s and 1980s. The technique was revolutionary. Investigators had uploaded the killer's DNA profile, obtained from crime scenes decades earlier, to GEDmatch, a public genealogy website where people uploaded their own DNA data to find relatives. The search found distant cousins of DeAngelo, and by building family trees and eliminating possibilities, investigators had narrowed the suspect pool to one person. When they confirmed his DNA matched the crime scene evidence, the case was solved. The Golden State Killer arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement. Suddenly, cases that had been cold for decades were potentially solvable. DNA that had been sitting in evidence lockers, uselessly waiting for a CODIS match that never came, could be run through genealogy databases and potentially traced to a suspect through their relatives. This technique, called investigative genetic genealogy or IgG, required specialized expertise, sophisticated family tree construction, and access to appropriate databases, but it worked. And once it worked for the Golden State Killer, law enforcement agencies across the country began examining their cold cases to identify which ones might be candidates for IgG. The Seattle Police Department's Cold Case Unit, in conjunction with the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, compiled a list of unsolved homicides where DNA evidence existed but had never matched anyone in CODIS. The Marcus Thompson case was near the top of that list. The DNA from the Heineken bottle was well preserved, the profile was complete, and the case had significant community interest given Marcus's profile and the unusual circumstances of his disappearance. In January 2019, the Seattle Police Department applied for a grant from a national organization that funded cold case investigations using advanced forensic techniques. The grant was approved, providing $25,000 to cover the costs of forensic genealogy analysis. The beer bottle DNA was sent to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company specializing in DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy for law enforcement. Their genealogists, working with the DNA profile, uploaded it to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, two public databases that allowed law enforcement searches with appropriate legal authorization. The initial results came back in March 2019. The DNA matched several individuals at the third and fourth cousin level, meaning they shared a common ancestor with the unknown drinker approximately 4 to 6 generations back. This is where the painstaking work of genetic genealogy began. A forensic genealogist named Catherine Pierce, working under contract with Parabon, took the list of DNA matches and began building family trees. She used census records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, and immigration records, tracing families backward through generations to identify common ancestors. The work was tedious and time-consuming, requiring fluency in genealogical research methods and access to subscription databases like Ancestry.com that held millions of historical documents. Over the course of 3 months, Pierce identified a common ancestral couple, Lars and Ingrid Bjornson, Norwegian immigrants, who'd settled in Washington state in the 1880s during the early days of Seattle's development. The Bjornson family tree was extensive, with branches spreading across the Pacific Northwest. Pierce focused on descendants who would have been between 20 and 60 years old in March 2000, living in or near Seattle, and male since the DNA profile indicated a male donor. She cross-referenced names with public records, property records, vehicle registrations, criminal histories, and any other information that might help narrow the pool. By June 2019, Pierce had narrowed the list to approximately 30 possible candidates. She provided this list to Seattle Police Department Detective Angela Martinez, who'd been assigned to follow up on the genetic genealogy leads. Martinez began the time-consuming process of investigating each candidate, looking for connections to Marcus Thompson, to the Snoqualmie Pass area, to anything that might explain why their DNA would be in Marcus's Jeep. Most of the candidates could be eliminated quickly. Some had died before 2000, others had been living in different states at the time. Several had ironclad alibis or circumstances that made their involvement impossible. One name stood out, Kenneth Morrison, who in March 2000 had been 34 years old and living in Issaquah, a small city just east of Seattle, along the I-90 corridor towards Snoqualmie Pass. Morrison worked as a mechanic at a Toyota dealership, had grown up in the area, and according to DMV records, owned a 1994 Ford F-150 pickup truck. He had a minor criminal history, a DUI in 1995, a disorderly conduct charge from a bar fight in 1997. But nothing violent, nothing that would have put his DNA in CODIS. He'd been married in 1998 and divorced in 2003, and as of 2019 he was living alone in a rental house in Auburn, working at the same dealership where he'd been employed for 20 years. Martinez built a case file on Morrison, looking for any connection to Marcus Thompson. She found none. Morrison had never worked for Amazon, had no apparent connection to the tech industry, didn't appear in any of Marcus's emails or phone records. On paper, there was no reason their lives would have intersected. But Morrison had lived along I-90, the route Marcus would have taken to reach Snoqualmie Pass, and he'd grown up hunting and fishing in the Cascade foothills, meaning he'd be familiar with the logging roads where Marcus's Jeep was found. The lack of an obvious connection didn't rule him out. Sometimes the most dangerous encounters were random stranger-on-stranger violence that left no logical trail. Martinez briefed her sergeant and the detective who'd originally worked the case, now retired but still consulted on cold investigations. They agreed they had enough to pursue Morrison further, but they needed direct DNA confirmation before seeking an arrest warrant. In Washington, as in most states, police could legally collect abandoned DNA from a suspect without a warrant, using items the suspect discarded in public. Martinez set up surveillance on Morrison, watching his movements and waiting for an opportunity. The opportunity came on July 12, 2019. Morrison stopped at a Starbucks in Auburn before work, ordered a coffee, and sat outside at a patio table to drink it while scrolling through his phone. After finishing, he tossed the empty cup into a public trash can and drove away. Martinez, who'd been watching from an unmarked vehicle, waited a few minutes, then approached the trash can, retrieved the cup using gloves and an evidence bag, and immediately transported it to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. The forensic scientists extracted epithelial cells from the drinking lid, built a full DNA profile, and compared it to the profile from the Heineken bottle found in Marcus's Jeep 19 years earlier. The comparison took 72 hours. On July 15, the results came back. Kenneth Morrison's DNA was a perfect match to the DNA on the beer bottle. The statistical probability of a coincidental match was 1 in several hundred billion, meaning it was virtually certain that Morrison had drunk from that bottle. Armed with this DNA match, along with the circumstantial evidence of Morrison's familiarity with the area where Marcus's Jeep was found, prosecutors from the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office sought an arrest warrant. On July 22, 2019, a judge signed the warrant, charging Kenneth Morrison with second-degree murder and kidnapping. The specific charge was second-degree rather than first-degree because prosecutors couldn't prove premeditation, but second-degree murder in Washington carried a potential sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole, especially given the circumstances. Morrison was arrested at his workplace on July 23, surrounded by co-workers who watched in shock as detectives handcuffed him and read him his rights. His initial reaction, according to the arresting officers, was confusion rather than panic. He asked what this was about, and when Detective Martinez told him it concerned Marcus Thompson, Morrison's face went blank. He said nothing else, invoking his right to remain silent and requesting an attorney. He was transported to King County Jail and held without bail pending his initial court appearance. The arrest made national news. 20 years after Marcus Thompson had vanished, his killer had been identified through the same kind of consumer DNA technology that had revolutionized ancestry research and connected millions of people to long-lost relatives. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Marcus, who'd worked in the early days of the Internet revolution, had been found through technologies that emerged directly from the world he'd helped build. The Seattle Times ran a front-page story with side-by-side photos of Marcus from 2000 and Morrison from his arrest, asking the question everyone wanted answered: why? Laura Thompson, now 81 years old, issued a statement through the police department. She said that while nothing could bring back her son or her husband, knowing that someone was being held accountable provided a measure of comfort she'd thought she'd never feel. She thanked the investigators who'd never given up, particularly Detective Martinez and the forensic genealogists who'd used cutting-edge science to do what traditional investigation couldn't. She expressed hope that other families with missing loved ones might find similar answers through these new techniques. The investigation didn't end with Morrison's arrest. Detectives needed to understand the connection between him and Marcus to build a case that explained how and why their paths had crossed that March evening in 2000. Martinez conducted extensive interviews with Morrison's ex-wife, his co-workers, his family members, anyone who might shed light on his movements and mindset around the time of Marcus's disappearance. She subpoenaed his work records from the Toyota dealership, examining his time cards and schedule to determine if he'd been working on March 18 or had the day off. What emerged was a portrait of a man living on the margins of Seattle's economic boom, watching the city transform around him, while his own circumstances remained stagnant. Morrison had grown up working class, the son of a Boeing factory worker and a supermarket cashier. He'd graduated from high school in 1984 and gone directly into automotive work, learning to fix cars at a time when that was considered a stable, respectable career. But by 2000, as tech workers like Marcus earned six figures and received stock options that made them millionaires, mechanics like Morrison were still making $15 an hour with minimal benefits and no path toward the kind of wealth being generated around them. Former co-workers described Morrison as quiet and competent, but harboring a deep resentment toward what he called the dot-com assholes who'd ruined Seattle. He complained about traffic getting worse, about housing prices making it impossible for normal people to live in the city, about tech workers treating service employees like they were invisible. Several people remembered Morrison making bitter comments about Amazon specifically, calling it a cancer that was destroying everything that had made Seattle special. This resentment provided a possible motive. Marcus Thompson, driving his Jeep with his North Face jacket and his Nokia phone and his six-figure salary, represented everything Morrison resented about the new Seattle. But establishing motive wasn't the same as proving what actually happened. Without Marcus's body, without witnesses, without a confession, prosecutors had to construct a narrative from the physical evidence and Morrison's known movements. The theory they developed went like this. On the evening of March 18, Marcus had some reason to drive east on I-90 towards Snoqualmie Pass. Perhaps he'd been meeting someone. Perhaps he'd decided to go for a short hike to clear his head after a frustrating day of coding. Perhaps he'd taken a wrong turn. Morrison, for reasons unclear, had encountered Marcus somewhere along that route. Maybe at a gas station, maybe at a rest stop, maybe Morrison had flagged him down on the road pretending to need help. However they met, Morrison had somehow gotten into Marcus's Jeep, bringing with him a Heineken beer. They'd driven to the remote logging road, either because Morrison directed them there, or because that's where Marcus had been headed. At some point, Morrison had attacked Marcus, possibly striking him from behind, possibly strangling him. After Marcus was dead or unconscious, Morrison had disposed of the body somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding that logging road, somewhere it might never be found or might not be discovered for decades. He'd wiped down surfaces in the Jeep to remove fingerprints but had forgotten about the beer bottle, his one critical mistake. Then he'd hiked back to wherever he'd left his own vehicle, and driven away, leaving Marcus's Jeep abandoned and Marcus to decompose in the forest where dozens of other victims had been left over the years. It was a plausible theory, but it had gaps. Why had Marcus been on that logging road in the first place? If this was a random encounter, what had triggered Morrison's violence? Where exactly was Marcus's body, and why? Despite extensive searches in 2000 and renewed searches in 2019 after Morrison's arrest, had it never been found? These questions would become central to the prosecution's case and the defense's attempts to create reasonable doubt. Morrison's attorney, a public defender named Jessica Reeves who specialized in homicide cases, argued vigorously that the DNA evidence, while placing Morrison in Marcus's Jeep, didn't prove murder. Morrison could have met Marcus innocuously, perhaps at a bar or gas station, and accepted a ride somewhere. The beer bottle could have been left in the Jeep during an entirely benign encounter. The fact that Marcus subsequently disappeared didn't automatically make Morrison responsible, especially without a body, without a murder weapon, without any evidence of violence in the Jeep itself. Reeves filed multiple motions, challenging the admissibility of the genetic genealogy evidence, arguing that it violated privacy rights, and that using a public database for law enforcement purposes, without explicit consent from all contributors, was unconstitutional. Judge Michael Patterson, who presided over the pre-trial hearings, denied most of these motions. He ruled that the use of GEDmatch for law enforcement purposes was legal, particularly given that users agreed to terms of service that explicitly allowed such uses. He ruled that the abandoned DNA from the Starbucks cup was obtained legally and could be used for comparison. He found that the DNA match, combined with Morrison's familiarity with the area and his apparent motive resentment toward tech workers, provided sufficient probable cause to proceed with prosecution. The trial was scheduled for March 2020, 20 years to the month after Marcus Thompson had disappeared. The COVID-19 pandemic delayed the trial by nearly a year, as courts across Washington state shut down or operated at limited capacity. During this delay, Prosecutors and defense attorneys continued their preparations, though both sides struggled with the fundamental challenge of the case. The absence of Marcus's body. In Washington state, it's possible to prosecute murder without a body, but it's significantly more difficult. Prosecutors needed to prove beyond reasonable doubt not only that Marcus was dead, but that Morrison had killed him, all without the physical evidence that a corpse would provide. The trial finally began in February 2021, held in King County Superior Court with extensive COVID-19 precautions in place. The courtroom was limited to essential personnel, attorneys, the defendant, and a reduced number of spectators including Laura Thompson, who attended every day despite her age and the pandemic risks. Rachel Steinberg, Marcus's former girlfriend, flew in from San Diego to testify, wearing a mask and sitting behind a plexiglass barrier as she described the man she'd loved and lost 20 years earlier. The prosecution, led by Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney James Holbrook, presented their case methodically over 3 weeks. They began with Marcus's life in Seattle, his work at Amazon, his relationship with Rachel, his routine and habits that made his sudden disappearance so inexplicable. Rachel testified about their last phone conversation, about Marcus's promise to meet her for dinner, about the growing panic she'd felt as hours turned into days without contact. David Chen, Marcus's former colleague, described the work Marcus had been doing that Saturday, his frustration with the coding problem he'd been trying to solve, his plan to head home and continue working from his apartment. Then Holbrook turned to the discovery of Marcus's Jeep. He called the hikers who'd found it, the detectives who'd processed the scene, the forensic technicians who'd catalogued every piece of evidence. Photographs of the Jeep's interior were displayed on screens around the courtroom, the North Face jacket draped over the passenger seat, the dead Nokia phone, and most importantly, the Heineken bottle sitting in the cup holder. Former Detective Thomas Brandt, now 71 years old and retired for more than a decade, testified about the original investigation, about the searches that had found nothing, about the beer bottle that had seemed significant but led nowhere in 2000. The DNA evidence formed the core of the prosecution's case. Holbrook called forensic scientists from the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, who explained how DNA had been extracted from the beer bottle in 2000, how the profile had been preserved for 2 decades, how it had been run through CODIS repeatedly, without finding a match. Then he introduced the new science forensic genealogist Catherine Pierce testified for an entire day about investigative genetic genealogy, walking the jury through the process of uploading DNA to GEDmatch, finding distant cousins, building family trees across generations, and eventually narrowing suspects to Kenneth Morrison. Detective Angela Martinez testified about the surveillance operation, about watching Morrison discard the Starbucks cup, about the agonizing wait for the comparison results. When the lab technician who'd conducted that comparison testified, confirming the match between Morrison's DNA and the beer bottle DNA, the courtroom fell silent. The statistical evidence was overwhelming. 1 in several hundred billion, Morrison had been in Marcus's Jeep. The question was why, and what had happened after. Holbrook then attempted to establish Morrison's motive and opportunity. He called Morrison's ex-wife, Jennifer Morrison, who testified reluctantly about her former husband's bitterness toward tech workers and Seattle's changing economy. She described arguments they'd had about money, about how Morrison felt left behind while everyone around them seemed to be getting rich. She confirmed that Morrison was familiar with the Cascade foothills, that he'd hunted deer and elk in those forests throughout his life, that he knew the logging roads and remote areas where people rarely went. The most damaging testimony came from a former co-worker of Morrison's named Rick Sanderson, who testified that on Monday, March 20, 2000, Morrison had arrived at work with scratches on his hands and face. When Sanderson asked what happened, Morrison claimed he'd been hiking over the weekend and had pushed through some blackberry bushes. Sanderson hadn't thought much of it at the time, but 20 years later, those scratches took on sinister significance. Could they have come from Marcus fighting for his life? The prosecution's closing argument painted Morrison as a man consumed by resentment who'd encountered Marcus by chance, perhaps at a gas station or rest stop along I-90. Morrison had recognized Marcus for what he represented, a young tech worker with money and privilege, and had talked his way into the Jeep, perhaps claiming his truck had broken down and he needed a ride. They'd driven to a remote location Morrison knew well, and there Morrison had killed Marcus, disposed of his body in the vast wilderness, and tried to cover his tracks. The beer bottle was his mistake, the piece of evidence he'd forgotten to remove, and it had taken 20 years and revolutionary technology to connect him to his crime. Jessica Reeves, the defense attorney, faced an uphill battle, but she mounted a vigorous defense. She began by emphasizing what the prosecution couldn't prove: they had no body, no murder weapon, no witnesses, no confession, no evidence of violence in the Jeep itself. The DNA proved Morrison had been in the vehicle and had drunk a beer there, but it didn't prove murder. Reeves presented an alternative narrative. Morrison and Marcus had met casually. Perhaps Morrison had flagged down Marcus for help with his truck. Marcus had given him a ride. Morrison had offered him a beer as thanks. They'd driven to the logging road so Morrison could retrieve his truck or show Marcus something in the woods. Then they'd parted ways, and something had happened to Marcus after Morrison left, something that had nothing to do with her client. Reeves called Morrison's sister, his current girlfriend, and several co-workers who testified that he was a quiet, hard-working man who'd never been violent, who had minor run-ins with the law but nothing approaching murder. She challenged the Scratch's testimony, noting that it was based on memories from 20 years ago, and that hiking in Pacific Northwest forests meant pushing through vegetation that could easily scratch someone. She argued that the prosecution was asking the jury to convict based on speculation and circumstantial evidence because they couldn't prove what actually happened. Most significantly, Reeves hammered on the absence of Marcus's body. She argued that without a body, there was no proof Marcus was even dead. He could have disappeared voluntarily, could have suffered an accident after Morrison left, could have been killed by someone else. The DNA placed Morrison in the Jeep, but told the jury nothing about what happened before or after. Washington law required proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and doubt, Reeves argued, was abundant in this case. The prosecution's rebuttal was simple and devastating. Holbrook pointed out that Marcus Thompson had not disappeared into thin air. He'd been a responsible, stable person with a good job, a loving family, a girlfriend waiting for him. His Jeep had been found in a remote location with all his possessions inside, with someone else's beer bottle present, with no logical explanation for why he'd be there. 20 years had passed without a single confirmed sighting, without Marcus accessing his bank accounts, without any sign he was alive. The DNA evidence didn't just prove Morrison was in the Jeep, it proved Morrison had lied by omission for 20 years, never coming forward to say he'd encountered Marcus, never offering to help the investigation. The jury deliberated for 5 days, an unusually long time that suggested they were taking their responsibilities seriously. The central question was whether circumstantial evidence, however compelling, was sufficient to convict without a body. On the 5th day, they returned with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of kidnapping. Several jurors were crying as the verdict was read. Kenneth Morrison showed no emotion, staring straight ahead as his attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. Under Washington law, second-degree murder carried a standard range sentence of between 10 years and life, but given the circumstances, the apparent premeditation, the disposal of the body, the 20 years of silence, prosecutors sought life without parole. Laura Thompson was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. She spoke for 10 minutes, her voice wavering but firm, about her son, about the future he'd been denied, about the decades her family had spent wondering and searching. She looked directly at Morrison and said that she hoped whatever time he had left would give him the opportunity to finally tell the truth about where Marcus was, so her son could have a proper burial. Morrison was given the chance to speak. His attorney advised him to say nothing, but Morrison stood and addressed the court. He maintained his innocence, insisting he'd been wrongly convicted based on insufficient evidence. He claimed he'd met Marcus by chance, had accepted a ride, had left him alive and well. He said he'd been too frightened to come forward after Marcus disappeared because he knew how it would look, that he'd be suspected simply for being in the Jeep. He expressed no remorse for Marcus's death because he insisted he had nothing to do with it. The statement felt hollow to everyone present, a final attempt to avoid responsibility rather than an honest accounting. Judge Patterson sentenced Morrison to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence available. He noted that Morrison's refusal to provide information about Marcus's remains, his apparent lack of remorse, and the calculated nature of the crime all warranted the harshest available punishment. Morrison was remanded to Washington State's corrections system and transported to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he would spend the rest of his life. The conviction didn't provide complete closure for Marcus's family because his body was never found. The Washington State Patrol and King County Sheriff's Office conducted additional searches in the weeks after Morrison's conviction, hoping he might provide information or that the trial testimony would spark new leads. They brought in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, searching areas near where the Jeep had been found and along Morrison's usual hunting routes. They found nothing. The Cascade foothills, with their dense forests and deep ravines and decades of natural decomposition, had kept their secret. In the months following the conviction, Morrison filed an appeal arguing that the genealogy evidence should have been excluded, and that the circumstantial case was insufficient for conviction. The Washington State Court of Appeals heard his case in late 2021, and denied the appeal in early 2022, finding that the trial court had properly admitted the evidence, and that sufficient proof existed for a reasonable jury to find guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Morrison's options for further appeal were limited, and legal experts noted that with DNA evidence this strong appellate courts rarely overturned convictions. The case attracted significant media attention, particularly from true crime podcasts and documentary producers. Several multi-episode series examined the case, interviewing detectives, family members, legal experts, and forensic genealogists about how the conviction was achieved. The case became a teaching example in law schools about prosecuting homicides without a body, and in forensic science programs about the revolutionary potential of investigative genetic genealogy. Catherine Pierce, the forensic genealogist, gave numerous interviews about her work on the case, emphasizing how consumer DNA databases had become an unexpected tool for solving violent crimes. The ethical implications of using consumer DNA databases for law enforcement purposes generated considerable debate. Civil liberties organizations expressed concern about privacy, noting that people who uploaded their DNA to find relatives never consented to having that information used to investigate their family members for crimes. Proponents argued that solving cold cases and bringing killers to justice outweighed privacy concerns, particularly when the database's terms of service explicitly allowed law enforcement access. Several states considered legislation to regulate or restrict such use, though as of 2024, most jurisdictions continued to allow it under appropriate legal frameworks. For Seattle as a community, the resolution of Marcus Thompson's case served as a reminder of the city's complicated relationship with its own transformation. Marcus had been part of the first wave of tech workers who'd come to Seattle during the dot-com era, drawn by the promise of being part of something revolutionary. Kenneth Morrison had been a casualty of that transformation, a working-class man who'd watched his city become unaffordable and unfamiliar, who directed his resentment toward the very people who were just trying to build careers and lives. The case highlighted how Seattle's economic stratification had created not just inequality but genuine animosity, a divide that in this instance had turned deadly. The conviction also validated the decision to preserve evidence carefully, even in cases that seemed unsolvable. The beer bottle had sat in an evidence locker for 20 years, a piece of physical evidence that yielded nothing through the technology available in 2000 but became the key to justice once science advanced. This lesson resonated with law enforcement agencies nationally, reinforcing the importance of proper evidence storage and the understanding that cases weren't truly cold as long as DNA evidence existed, and technology continued to evolve. Laura Thompson lived to see Morrison convicted, but passed away in December 2022 at age 84. Her obituary noted that she devoted the final 2 decades of her life to seeking justice for her son, and had found it through perseverance and advances in forensic science. She was buried beside her husband David in a cemetery in Palo Alto, California, where they'd raised Marcus. The family placed a memorial stone for Marcus at the gravesite as well, acknowledging that while his body had never been recovered, his memory deserved recognition alongside his parents. Rachel Steinberg, who'd moved on with her life but never forgotten Marcus, told reporters after Morrison's conviction that learning what happened provided a kind of peace she'd thought impossible. For 20 years, She'd lived with the torture of not knowing whether Marcus had suffered, whether he'd thought of her in his final moments, whether there was anything she could have done differently that night when he didn't show up for dinner. The conviction didn't answer all those questions, but it provided certainty that Marcus was dead, that he hadn't chosen to leave, that someone specific was responsible for destroying the future they might have had together. The Seattle tech community, now vastly larger and more influential than in 2000, recognized Marcus as one of their own, whose story had been forgotten in the rush of innovation and growth. Amazon, the company Marcus had worked for, created a memorial scholarship in his name for computer science students from underrepresented backgrounds, a way of honoring his memory while contributing to the diversity he'd valued. The scholarship announcement noted that Marcus had been part of the generation that built the foundation of modern e-commerce, and that his loss was felt not just by his family, but by everyone who'd worked alongside him during those early years. As of 2024, Kenneth Morrison remains incarcerated at Washington State Penitentiary, maintaining his innocence in occasional letters to newspapers and advocacy groups. He's filed additional appeals challenging various aspects of his conviction, all of which have been denied. He's now 61 years old, and unless Washington's laws change, he'll die in prison without ever experiencing freedom again. Some view this as appropriate justice for taking Marcus's life. Others, including certain civil liberties advocates, argue that convicting someone without a body sets dangerous precedents, even when DNA evidence is compelling. The location of Marcus Thompson's remains is still unknown. Theories abound. He could be in a deep ravine, covered by decades of soil and vegetation. He could be in one of the many abandoned mine shafts that dot the Cascades. He could be submerged in a mountain lake where cold water and depth prevent decomposition from bringing bodies to the surface. Some believe Morrison placed the body somewhere it would never be found, perhaps in a remote area accessible only to someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Others think it's only a matter of time before a hiker or hunter stumbles across remains that will finally confirm what everyone already knows. Marcus Thompson died in March 2000, his body left in the wilderness that makes the Pacific Northwest beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. The case fundamentally changed how cold case investigations were conducted in Washington state and beyond. The success of genetic genealogy in solving Marcus's murder led to dozens of other cold cases being reopened and submitted for similar analysis. Between 2020 and 2024, Washington state alone solved more than 30 previously unsolvable homicides using investigative genetic genealogy, bringing closure to families who'd waited decades for answers. The technique wasn't perfect. It required good DNA samples, suspects with relatives in genealogy databases, and substantial time and money, but it worked often enough to become a standard tool in the cold case investigator's arsenal. For the Thompson family, the conviction represented justice delayed but not denied, validation that persistence in science could overcome even 2 decades of silence. Laura Thompson had told detectives repeatedly during those 20 years that she believed someone would eventually be held accountable, that the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. She was right, though she lived just long enough to see it happen. Her faith in eventual justice, maintained through years when it seemed unreasonable, had been vindicated by a beer bottle, a genealogy database, and investigators who refused to let a case die just because traditional methods had failed. The story of Marcus Thompson resonates because it touches on themes larger than one person's murder. It's about how quickly cities can transform, leaving some people behind while elevating others. It's about how technology creates both victims and solutions, how the same digital revolution that brought Marcus to Seattle eventually identified his killer. It's about the randomness of violence, how an encounter between strangers can end in death for reasons that may never be fully understood. And it's about persistence, about families who won't stop searching, investigators who won't stop working, and science that continues advancing until the impossible becomes routine. Seattle today is a city Marcus would barely recognize. Amazon has become one of the world's most valuable companies, employing tens of thousands of people and dominating the city's skyline with dozens of glass towers. The dot-com era that Marcus was part of feels quaint in retrospect, a time of optimism and relatively modest ambitions compared to the current tech giants. South Lake Union, where Marcus lived in a $1,800 apartment, now features luxury high-rises where one bedrooms rent for over $3,000. The economic inequality that fueled Morrison's resentment has only intensified, creating a city of extremes where tech workers earn hundreds of thousands while service workers struggle to afford rent. But Seattle also remains a city surrounded by extraordinary natural beauty, by mountains and water and forests that draw people from around the world. The logging roads where Marcus's Jeep was found still wind through the Cascades, used by fewer people now as outdoor recreation has become more regulated and populations have shifted. Those forests keep many secrets, and Marcus's body is one of them, hidden somewhere in the vast wilderness that has swallowed countless others over the decades. The case stands as a reminder that in the modern world, few crimes remain unsolvable forever. DNA doesn't degrade if properly stored. Databases grow larger every year, as more people upload their genetic information. Technology that seems revolutionary today will be surpassed by techniques we haven't imagined yet. Killers who think they've escaped justice by avoiding detection for years or decades are discovering that the past isn't past, that evidence waits patiently for science to catch up, and that the geographic distance and time that once protected them have become meaningless in an era of digital databases and genetic genealogy. For families of missing people, the Marcus Thompson case offers both hope and heartbreak. Hope because it proves that cold cases can be solved, that justice can come even after extraordinary delays, that advances in forensic science can answer questions that traditional investigation couldn't. Heartbreak because Marcus's body was never found, because his family endured 20 years of uncertainty before getting answers, because the conviction, while meaningful, couldn't restore what was lost or give Marcus back the life he should have lived. 24 years after Marcus Thompson left Amazon's headquarters for the last time, his case has become part of Seattle's dark history, alongside the Green River Killer and other crimes that revealed how violence lurks beneath even the most prosperous and beautiful cities. His story is taught in forensic science classes, discussed in true crime forums, referenced in legal debates about privacy and technology. But more than anything, it's a reminder that every missing person represents a family's ongoing nightmare, that unsolved cases inflict a particular kind of suffering that endures across years and decades, and that the resolution, when it finally comes, brings not closure, but a different kind of grief, the grief of knowing what happened, of understanding the randomness and cruelty of it, of recognizing that someone walked free for 20 years while a family suffered without answers. Kenneth Morrison took something irreplaceable when he killed Marcus Thompson. He took a son from parents who never stopped searching, a partner from someone who never fully moved on, a friend and colleague from people who remembered him decades later. He took a future that should have included career success, perhaps marriage and children, contributions to the technology industry he was passionate about, years of hiking in the mountains he loved. And by hiding Marcus's body and staying silent for 20 years, he extended that theft, turning one violent act into 2 decades of ongoing harm. The conviction brought accountability, but not completeness. Marcus Thompson is still missing, his remains somewhere in the Cascade foothills, and until he's found, a part of his family's grief remains unresolved. They can't visit his grave, can't have the ritual of burial, can't mark a physical place where he rests. The conviction named his killer, and ensured that killer would die in prison, but it couldn't give them back their son or tell them exactly where to look in the thousands of square miles of wilderness where he might be. This is the complicated reality of justice in cold cases solved through modern forensic science. The techniques work, the science is sound, the convictions hold up on appeal, but they can't undo time, can't restore what was lost, can't give families those 20 years back. They can only provide what justice has always provided: accountability, a public recognition of harm, and the assurance that society takes seriously the taking of a life, even when that taking occurred in a different era, in a different version of the city, between strangers whose paths crossed for reasons that may never be fully understood. The beer bottle sits in an evidence locker still, a piece of green glass that became the instrument of justice. The Jeep Cherokee was eventually sold at police auction, bought by someone who probably has no idea of its history. The logging road where it was found is still there, still remote, still surrounded by forest where Marcus Thompson's remains lie undiscovered. And Seattle continues growing, changing, transforming into something new while the past waits beneath the surface, ready to emerge whenever someone looks closely enough to see it.